Interstate Highway System, a series of divided freeways that connect various towns and cities through dedicated roadways only accessible through on- and off-ramps. Undoubtedly one of the largest infrastructure projects in American history, it is often seen as the primary reason of the downfall of American railroading. One of the primary reasons as to why the interstates were as effective as they were driving away the railroad's business, however, is that all of them were built adjacent to major railroad main lines that connected key cities throughout the country, as many of these towns were developed as a direct result of the railroad running through there years prior. Here, we'll be looking into the rail-based origins of the routes of every single freeway in the Interstate Highway System, and what rail alternatives are still available near the freeway today. First off, I'd like to note that the Interstate Highway System is primarily numbered with odd routes running north and south, and even routes running east and west, with numbers divisible by 5 often being much longer coast-to-coast routes. However, there are a few gaps in its numbering system, in which for some reason not every number is included, and some of these freeways don't necessarily have to run between 2 or more states. Our first example for this video perfectly describes these discrepancies, as we're starting off with I-2, which runs between Benitez and Harlington, Texas. I-2 is one of the newest highways, officially opening in 2013, and it's also one of the shortest at only 47 miles long, as it runs between a few towns on the southern Texas border, primarily connecting US Highways 83 and 77, smaller highways that aren't divided and have direct access points with some traffic lights. Based on this transportation engineering terminology, I-2 and other interstates should technically be called the Interstate Freeway System, when compared to the format of US highways, but that's just a little fun fact about road engineering. Anyways, despite its short length and simple upgrades of existing highways, there was rail service within this region, as the Missouri Pacific Railroad primarily operated passenger and freight service between Brownsville and Rio Grande City via McAllen. The line initially opened in 1903 under the St. Louis, Brownsville, and Mexico Railway before becoming the Missouri Pacific subsidiary in 1924, until being bought out in 1956. Eventually, after Missouri Pacific merged with Union Pacific in 1983, this branch line became a short line named the Border Pacific Railroad, which currently operates local freight runs with a Union Pacific-inspired GP7. After covering the railroad relation to this small highway with a lot of history, I'll try to keep some of the descriptions for large interstates brief, since the rail-based origins would be too long and complicated to sum up in a few sentences. Up next on the list we have I-4 connecting 3 of Florida's largest regions, Tampa, Orlando, and Daytona Beach. This highway follows the Atlantic Coastline's main line between Orlando and Tampa, as well as a Florida East Coast branch line connecting the ACL to Orlando. Today, this corridor sees passenger service from Amtrak Silver Star from New York to Miami, with a detour to Tampa before backing up onto the main line to Miami again, while pretty much all freight south to Jacksonville and the East Coast is handled by CSX. Although the FEC branch from Orlando to Daytona Beach no longer exists, FEC's successor Brightline is planning on directly utilizing the median of I-4 for their Orlando to Tampa service in the coming years. Railway medians and highways is a great precedent to follow for new build railway lines, since it doesn't involve too much land acquisition and utilizes otherwise empty space in an already existing freeway. Up next is our first freeway divisible by 5, specifically I-5, that runs from San Diego to Seattle. This north to south border service essentially covers 2 main lines and a popular branch line, specifically the Santa Fe Surf Line from San Diego to Los Angeles, Southern Pacific's inland route from LA to Stockton, and their Shasta route from Stockton to Portland, and a Pacific Northwest corridor jointly operated by Union Pacific, Northern Pacific, and Great Northern. With the exception of San Diego, this entire corridor can be covered by Amtrak's Coast Starlight from Los Angeles to Seattle, their Pacific Surfliner running from San Diego to Los Angeles and San Luis Obispo, and their Cascade service running from Eugene, Oregon to Vancouver, British Columbia. Freight service is otherwise covered by BNSF from San Diego to LA, Union Pacific from LA to Mount Shasta, then transfers to the Central Oregon and Pacific, a short line railroad that runs on the more direct but hilly Shasta route to Portland, and then jointly operated BNSF and UP trackage from Portland to Vancouver. The next 2 entries are somewhat related, since I-8 is essentially a San Diego branch of I-10 that runs from San Diego to Jacksonville. Starting off with the former, this freeway parallels the Southern Pacific branch line that also ran to San Diego, originally known as the San Diego and Arizona Railway, which opened in 1919 and later became known as the San Diego and Arizona Eastern Railway. Based on the various engineering challenges of this route running through Southern California and into Mexico, this line was dubbed the Impossible Railroad, as it was a Southern Pacific subsidiary that eventually went through many owners. Today, the line is technically owned by the San Diego and Imperial Valley Railroad, which runs freight on the existing San Diego light rail trackage, before being transferred to Baja California Railroad while in Mexico, and then supposedly back to the SDIV before transferring to Union Pacific to connect to their Sunset route from Placer City to Niland, California, and the rest of I-8 running to Arizona is close enough to the SB Sunset route. Meanwhile, the much larger I-10 not only covers the entirety of the Sunset route from Los Angeles to New Orleans, but it also covers the Louisville-Nashville's Gulf Coast line from New Orleans to Chattahoochee, Florida, and the Seaboard Airline route to Jacksonville. The Sunset Route portion of this line is owned entirely by Union Pacific, as it's served by one of two Amtrak routes that only runs 3 times a week instead of once a day, that being the Sunset Limited from LA to New Orleans, as well as another tri-weekly extension of the Texas Eagle from San Antonio to LA. Amtrak service between New Orleans and Mobile, Alabama has been an ongoing debate against CSX since they don't want more passenger trains to interfere with their freight runs, with Gulf Coast service finally expected to start later this year, while the rest of the route to Jacksonville used to see service by the Sunset Limited until 2005, when local railroads such as CSX and Florida Gulf and Atlantic refused to upgrade their tracks to passenger rail standards after damage from Hurricane Katrina, thus leaving the entire region as temporarily suspended on Amtrak's maps and passenger rail proposal maps alike since 2005, even though there is some hope for Gulf Coast service to eventually reach Jacksonville. Up next, we have another small and recent highway upgrade known as I-11, which connects US Highways 93 and 95 between Henderson and Boulder City, Nevada, as it was given interstate status in 2017. Interestingly enough, this region's only railway history is that it was a freight spur from Union Pacific Salt Lake City to Los Angeles main line that was built in 1931 to transport materials to help construct the Hoover Dam. After this project was completed, the line was used for local freight service by UP ever since, with the segment between Boulder City and Texas Acres being purchased by the Nevada State Railroad Museum for tourist service, with most of their trains being led by a certain GP30 that was featured in an episode of Remarkable Legends. Next, we have yet another highway that branches off from I-10, specifically I-12 running between Baton Rouge and Slidell, Louisiana. Since this is essentially a bypass that goes around New Orleans instead of through it like I-10, the closest rail origins this highway has is an Illinois Central branch that connects the former Yazoo Mississippi Valley Railroad and New Orleans, Jackson, and Great Northern from Baton Rouge to Hammond, which is currently served as a branch line of Canadian National, then another now abandoned IC branch line from Hammond to Covington, before meeting with the also abandoned Gulf Mobile and Ohio branch that ran to Slidell. One little fact about the terminus of this town is that it's the first stop outside of New Orleans for the Amtrak Crescent, while Baton Rouge to New Orleans service is being considered by various transit agencies, so maybe one can replace this route through a transfer at New Orleans. Coming up, we have yet another recently built US highway upgrade in the southwest, as I-14 runs between Caparas Cove and Belton, Texas. This interstate was also upgraded in 2017, as it connects US Highway 190 and I-35, while the segment covers a fraction of a much larger route owned by the Santa Fe, originally the Gulf Colorado and Santa Fe Railway that ran from Temple to Lubbock, and also converged with the Santa Fe's Fort Worth to Houston main line at Temple, which is also where Amtrak's Texas Chief transfers from BNSF trackage to Union Pacific trackage in order to reach San Antonio. Once again, it's time for another highway divisible by 5, meaning that this freeway is refreshingly longer than the last few, as I-15 runs from Los Angeles to the Montana-Canada border, where it continues to Alberta Highway 4 to Calgary. In terms of passenger rail history, this freeway's rail origins are rather tragic, as the entire route used to see at least some passenger runs, albeit decreasing in importance heading further north, and even though the route is still intact, it only sees freight service by Union Pacific and BNSF. Anyways, starting from LA, I-15 follows the route of the Union Pacific City of Los Angeles, one of their premier city of long-distance trains, as it runs through Las Vegas and Salt Lake City, then follows the route of the secondary Butte Special from Salt Lake City to Butte, Montana, and then it follows various Great Northern branch lines with mixed trains, or trains that carry both passenger and freight, from Butte to Sweetgrass, where it transfers to Canadian Pacific for service to Calgary. Now, we have an interstate that isn't too short when compared to the other ones, but still limited to one state, as I-16 runs between Macon and Savannah, Georgia. Despite Atlanta to Savannah via Macon service being made popular by the Central of Georgia's Nancy Hanks, I-16 surprisingly follows the much lesser-known Seaboard Airline branch to Macon, with the segment between Macon and Fidelia being constructed in 1872 by the Macon, Dublin, and Savannah Railroad, as it later became a Seaboard Airline subsidiary. In addition to the Macon branch, all Seaboard Airline trackage from Savannah to Montgomery, Alabama is currently run by the Georgia Central Short Line, which only operates freight, even though there have been various attempts to reintroduce frequent passenger rail service throughout the state. Another relatively short connector interstate is I-17, which connects I-10 at Phoenix and I-40 in Flagstaff. Although it doesn't directly parallel a railroad, the closest rail line which takes a bit of a longer detour is the Santa Fe's Phoenix branch, originally the Santa Fe, Prescott, and Phoenix Railway that opened in 1891, with freight service currently operated by its predecessor, BNSF. Even though the line initially ended in Ash Fork, its connection to the Santa Fe's main line was cut off by a bypass, but if you were to travel from Ash Fork to Flagstaff along the former main line, you would also pass Williams, where the Grand Canyon Railroad transports tourists to one of the state's greatest attractions to this day. Next, we have another relatively short interstate in Arizona, as I-19 connects I-10 in Tucson with Mexican Federal Highway 15 at the Mexican border at Nogales. Once again, this interstate only covers a small segment of the full railroad line in question, as the Southern Pacific operated an international service by branching off from the Sunset Route at Tucson and running past the border at Nogales and ran all the way to Guadalajara. This line was initially built by the Sonora Railway in 1882 as a subsidiary of the Santa Fe, before leasing it to SB as the Southern Pacific Railroad of Mexico in 1898. That's right, the Southern Pacific had their own Mexican counterpart just like KCSDM, and they even operated passenger service on this line, specifically to El Yaqui between Los Angeles and Mexico City. While the region of focus in the States remained with SP until being acquired by Union Pacific in 1996, the line south of the border became the Ferrocarril del Pacífico in 1951, before being purchased by the Ferrocarriles Nacionales de Mexico, or NDM, in 1984, before being privatized into Ferromex in 1996, which oddly enough is 26% owned by Union Pacific back in the States, as the line only saw freight since becoming the FDLP in 1951. Even though this next interstate is a coast-to-coast one, it also branches from I-10, which itself is another coast-to-coast route. I-20 branches off at Levinson, Texas, runs through Dallas, Birmingham, Atlanta, and eventually Florence, South Carolina. The segment branching from SP's Sunset Route is actually a Missouri Pacific line, originally the Texas and Pacific Railroad, that ran from El Paso to Dallas and Shreveport. I-20 eventually follows the Illinois Central Shreveport Speedway, an almost straight line from Shreveport, Louisiana to Meridian, Mississippi, before following the Southern Railway main line to Atlanta, then the Atlanta and West Point Railroad main lines from Atlanta to Augusta, then another Southern Railway branch line to Columbia, South Carolina, and finally an Atlantic coastline branch from Columbia to Florence. Although the only section that sees passenger service today is between Meridian and Atlanta with Amtrak's Crescent, with the rest of the line being a mixture of freight ownership by Union Pacific, Kansas City Southern, Norfolk Southern, and CSX, there are plans to extend the Crescent along the I-20 corridor, as it's known, along with the Shreveport Speedway, from Meridian to Dallas, even though the same region was also considered for privately operated high-speed service similar to Brightline. Nearby, I-22 covers a somewhat overlooked region in railroading history, as it runs between Memphis and Birmingham, an area that was once served by the St. Louis and San Francisco Railway, better known as the Frisco. This corridor initially saw long-distance passenger runs such as the Kansas City, Florida Special, where service would be transferred to the Southern Railway at Birmingham until it became freight only in the late 60s, but this line is currently operated by BNSF, as the Frisco was purchased by Burlington Northern in 1980. Thus making the line the only territory operated by BNSF to enter Mississippi and Alabama. Speaking of overlooked rail lines starting in Tennessee, I-24 follows a weird route from Chattanooga to Marion, Illinois, where it merges with I-57. Starting from the southern terminus of Chattanooga, it follows the Nashville, Chattanooga, and St. Louis mainline to Nashville, a section that's currently being studied for Amtrak restoration between Atlanta and Nashville. Then it runs directly in between the Louisville and Nashville and Tennessee Central branch line to Oak Grove, Kentucky. Then it leaves CSX track ownership and onto a now abandoned Illinois Central branch line to Princeton, then present-day Paducah and Louisville trackage to Paducah, and then Burlington route trackage from Metropolis, Illinois to West Vienna, where it converges with the Chicago and Eastern Illinois main line now owned by Union Pacific. Man, those are a lot of unlikely combinations in the Corn Belt. At least the next freeway has more obvious road origins for most of its duration, as I-25 runs from Las Cruces, New Mexico to Buffalo, Wyoming via Pueblo and Denver. The freeway follows the Santa Fe, now BNSF El Paso branch from Las Cruces to Albuquerque, where it eventually meets up with the Santa Fe mainline to Trinidad, Colorado, which also sees the Amtrak Southwest Chief. Then it follows the Front Range corridor between Pueblo and Cheyenne, which is currently undergoing future service by Amtrak and Front Range Passenger Rail along former Rio Grande and Burlington trackage, and then it follows the Burlington route up to Casper, Wyoming, and runs directly between the Burlington's two coalfield main lines that eventually loop around Billings, Montana, as these two lines that run through Wyoming's Powder River Basin are considered the last frontier for coal mining, and see the most freight traffic of any rail line in North America, with 4 tracks carrying nothing but BNSF and UP coal trains on the Orange subdivision. Heading back south, we have another decently sized interstate that starts in a small part of Tennessee, but its rail origins are sporadic to say the least. I-26 runs from Kingsport, Tennessee to Columbia, South Carolina through Asheville and essentially the heart of South Carolina, with a lot of reroutes and jumping between railroad branch lines. Are you ready? Here we go. Starting off, I-26 follows the former Clinchville main line until Riverview, North Carolina, where the interstate decides to split off just before the Great Smoky Mountains and connects with the Southern Railway at Asheville, where it parallels the legendary but soon-to-be trailified Saluda grade, one of the steepest railway grades in the world at 4.9%. Once it reaches Spartansburg, I-26 then follows an Atlantic coastline branch to McCormick before splitting off and following the Columbia, Newbury, and Lawrence Railroad main line from Lawrence to Columbia, then runs in between a Seaboard Airline main and a Southern Railway branch until it gets closer and closer to the Southern line by the time it reaches Charleston. So overall, I-26 runs pretty close to a total of 6 different branch lines by 4 railroads, with all of them except for the southern routes being owned by CSX, and all seeing varying levels of freight service. Wow, that is some complex routing for the South. And it goes to show that some interstates try to weave in between various railroad lines instead of directly paralleling them for the entirety of the route. Thankfully, I-27 is next on the list and is much easier to follow, as it essentially parallels the Santa Fe's Lubbock to Amarillo branch, which essentially has the same history as I-14's rail origins, in which they were both initially operated by a Santa Fe predecessor, specifically the Panhandle and Santa Fe Railway. Although, plenty of Santa Fe branch lines spurred from Lubbock to other towns including Crosbytown, Bledsoe, and Clovis, while Amarillo is part of the BNSF Southern Transcon from Kansas City to Albuquerque on a faster alignment than the Santa Fe's original main line, as well as a connecting line that runs from Amarillo to the former main line at La Junta, Colorado. Heading further up north is an interstate that's unusually long for a number that's not divisible by 5, as I-29 spans from Kansas City along the Missouri River and Red River to the North Dakota-Canada border at Pembina, before continuing along Canada Highway 75 to Winnipeg. Since the purpose of many of these Midwestern railroads was to connect the countless farms to the prairies to the rest of the country by shipping their goods, it's pretty hard to determine which lines exactly I-29 is the closest to, but I'll try my best. Starting from Kansas City, the freeway follows the Burlington route's Pioneer Zephyr to Omaha on present-day BNSF trackage, then the Chicago and Northwestern Sioux City, Iowa branch on present-day Union Pacific trackage, followed by a Milwaukee Road branch to Sioux Falls, South Dakota via BNSF and DNI railroads, and then I suppose the next direct rail line will be the Great Northern's half-abandoned Sioux Falls branch to Waterton, before being somewhat close to abandoned Milwaukee Road trackage to Wahpeton, North Dakota, where it meets up with the Great Northern Main Line to Grand Forks and Grafton, before finally splitting off into a Northern Pacific branch line to Pembina, before transferring to Canadian National trackage to Winnipeg. I would have tried to count up all the branch lines the Sarah State is adjacent to, but since there are so many that simply don't connect the full segment of the freeway, I'm not even going to try to add all these up in fear of missing out another branch line that I-29 is somewhat close to. Despite being a route divisible by 5, the railroad origins of I-30 are much easier to determine, as it runs from Fort Worth to Little Rock, Arkansas. Even though this interstate essentially covers half of the Missouri Pacific Main Line, currently operated by Amtrak's Texas Eagle and by Union Pacific for freight, the only exception to this is between Texarkana and Dallas, where it's closer to the Cotton Belt Railroad, a Southern Pacific subsidiary, while turning to Greenville before following the Missouri-Kansas-Texas branch line from Greenville to Dallas. This section is operated by Union Pacific, the Blackland Shortline Railroad, and the Dallas, Garland, and Northeastern Railroads respectively. But as if to say that I-29 was in fact misinterpreted as a longer than usual interstate through the Midwest, the numbering list jumps to I-35, which covers a similar Midwest region, but this time all the way from Loretto, Texas to Duluth, Minnesota, and runs through just as many sporadic rural Midwestern branch lines. This is going to be fun mapping. Luckily for me, this line starts off pretty simple as it follows the Southern Pacific present-day Union Pacific from Loretto to Austin, before switching off to Missouri-Kansas-Texas trackage currently owned by UP to Fort Worth. Then it follows the Santa Fe Texas Chief route from Fort Worth all the way to Kansas City, which is also where easy determinations end. Despite I-35 passing through a lot of Burlington route branch lines in Missouri, I'm going to select the abandoned Chicago Great Western Main Line from Kansas City to Des Moines, Iowa, as the closest direct route for this segment, before following the Rock Islands Des Moines to St. Paul line currently operated by UP, before finally reaching Duluth along the lesser-known and partially abandoned Northern Pacific line to Duluth. Thankfully, this wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be, but it still goes through a lot of main lines and secondaries for various fallen flags. The next interstate also starts in Texas, but is thankfully much shorter than the last one, as I-37 connects San Antonio with Corpus Christi, Texas, along a former Missouri Pacific branch. The line was initially constructed by the San Antonio, Uvalde, and Gulf Railroad in 1886, before being acquired by the Missouri Pacific, who ran short passenger trains between the region until the 40s, as the line was eventually taken over by Union Pacific when it acquired the Mopac in 1982. or at least when they assumed UP's corporate identity and technically still operated as Missouri Pacific. Up next, I-39 is essentially a straight line between Bloomington, Illinois and Wausau, Wisconsin, that goes right through the center of the two states, as well as a bunch of different Midwestern railroad branches. Again. Starting off, I-39 follows an abandoned Illinois Central branch line to Mendota, then an abandoned Milwaukee Road branch to Rochelle, a Burlington Route branch to Rockford operated by the simply named Illinois Railroad, then a Milwaukee Road branch to Janesville, Wisconsin operated by a supposedly unknown railroad since Railguide won't list a clear operator of the line, another Milwaukee Road line to Madison and Portage operated by the Wisconsin Southern CP Rail, an abandoned Sioux Line branch to Stevens Point, and finally, another Sioux Line branch to Wausau on track now owned by Canadian National. That's the second interstate ending in a 9 that went through a lot of branch lines in the Midwest, but it's still not as hard to map as I-29. Yes, next we have I-40, the same interstate that bypassed Route 66 in the classic 2006 movie Cars, which I'm also an avid fan of. But unlike the Chicago to LA journey of Route 66, I-40 spans from Barstow, California to Wilmington, North Carolina, going from the Atlantic Ocean to the California desert. Before I even attempt to connect the road origins of this interstate, two main lines I can immediately pick out are the Santa Fe's main line from Barstow to Albuquerque, which currently sees service from Amtrak Southwest Chief, and the Rock Island's Choctaw Rocket from Albuquerque to Memphis, which hasn't seen any passenger service since the 60s. As for the rest of the interstate, it once again looks a bit complicated, but here goes. As expected, I-40 follows the predicted western road lines up until Oklahoma City, where it heads north and eventually parallels the Missouri Pacific Secondary from Sallisaw to Little Rock before following the Rock Island to Memphis. From here, it loosely follows a Louisville-Nashville Secondary to Memphis before switching to a Nashville, Chattanooga, and St. Louis line near McKenzie, Tennessee, and on to Nashville. Then it follows the Tennessee Central Main Line from Nashville to Harriman, currently operated by the National and Eastern, before transferring to a bunch of different Southern Railway branches owned by Norfolk Southern, loosely passes by Asheville, North Carolina, and then parallels the Southern to Durham, before nosediving towards an Atlantic Coastline branch to Wilmington, owned by CSX, where this mighty interstate ends. This last leg of I-40 heading east is currently being studied by NCDOT for future Amtrak service to Wilmington, as Piedmont passenger service between Charlotte and Raleigh has been prosperous thanks to more people moving to the area. Oh look, another Midwestern interstate. This one doesn't look too long. I sure hope it doesn't involve complicated routing between multiple railroads, and of course it does. Technically, I-41 wasn't upgraded to interstate status until 2015, and it's technically merged with I-94 and I-43 until Greenfield, so this is where we'll start our review. From here, the interstate follows the Chicago Northwestern connector to Butler, currently owned by UP, then jumps over to a Wisconsin and Southern-owned Milwaukee Road branch to Slinger, then a Sioux Line secondary to Appleton operated by Canadian National, while the same rail follows a former C&NW branch to Green Bay, where I-41 ends. I know this isn't too bad when compared to other interstates, but I don't know whether I should blame the railroads for making their branch lines so sporadic, or the interstates for hopping between multiple branch lines. Even though I-42 is listed on Wikipedia, it's still proposed and will therefore be disqualified from this video, which leads us to I-43, which covers, oh come on, I just covered this region. Anyways, I-43 starts from Beloit as it spurs from I-39, as it jumps between a partially abandoned Milwaukee Road branch to Elkhorn, a Sioux Line main line to Chicago owned by CN near Mukwonago, then loosely follows the CNW secondary from Waukesha to Milwaukee, where it runs in the opposite direction of I-41 and heads northward, where it parallels a direct CNW secondary to Green Bay, which changes ownership between Union Pacific, Canadian National, Abandoned, and the Fox Valley and Lake Superior. There have been talks to restore service to Green Bay from Milwaukee, since Green Bay never saw any Amtrak service throughout its history, although it would likely follow the current CN route near Fond du Lac and Neenah near I-41, since there's more population density there. I-44 runs between St. Louis and Wichita Falls, Texas, and essentially follows the route of the Frisco Road's Tolson up until Oklahoma City, currently owned by BNSF, other than a slight diversion towards the Missouri Pacific line owned by Missouri and Northern Arkansas between Mount Vernon and Joplin, Missouri. Then it follows more ex-Frisco trackage to Lawton, currently owned by the Stillwater Central. But just to specifically make the purpose of this video harder, I-44 heads towards an abandoned Rock Island branch to Grandfield, and finally a Missouri-Kansas-Texas branch to Wichita Falls on the present-day Wichita, Tillman, and Jackson Railroad. There isn't any passenger service on this line today, but Tulsa is a pretty underrated city when it comes to passenger rail proposals, especially for service heading east from the city. Next we have I-45, running between the coveted Dallas to Houston corridor. Technically, this interstate parallels various Southern Pacific, Burlington Route, and Rock Island lines between the two cities, but that just goes to show how big the corridor is. and it's been heavily congested ever since Amtrak discontinued long-distance service along the corridor in 1996. Because of this, a new privately operated high-speed rail service named Texas Central Railway is planning on restoring passenger rail service between the two largest cities in Texas by building an entirely new right-of-way for 200-mile-per-hour service with imported Shinkansen N700S train sets from Japan. Although, this project ran into multiple delays from NIMBYs and lawmakers who preferred a car and plane over the train, as there is currently no starting date for Texas Central as of yet, although it highlights one of the largest transportation hubs in the country that desperately needs passenger rail. Almost 5,000 words into the script, we finally reach an interstate that's split into two sections, as I-49 runs between Kansas City and Fort Smith, Arkansas, as well as Texarkana and Lafayette, Louisiana. Based on how close it traveled to the state border, I assumed that this interstate would easily follow the Kansas City Southern Main Line. Turns out, I wasn't even close. Right out of Kansas City, I-49 follows the much less famous abandoned Frisco route to Harrisonville, Missouri, then an even less famous Missouri Pacific route to Joplin, currently operated by the Missouri and North Arkansas. Then it follows the Kansas City Southern Main Line to Gravette, Arkansas, just before jumping to another ex-Frisco line to Fort Smith ran by the Arkansas-Missouri Railroad, and then I-49 ceases to exist. It then respawns not too far away at Texarkana, where, once again, it follows an abandoned Missouri Pacific line instead of Kansas City Southern to Shreveport, and then runs directly in between the ex-Mopac and KCS routes before swinging over to a Union Pacific-owned ex-Mopac route to Alexandria, and finally follows an abandoned Southern Pacific branch to Lafayette. This is what I get for making assumptions about interstate routing before checking Railguide. Surprisingly, there is no I-50, as the list skips 6 whole numbers, with I-55 being the next interstate to be reviewed, as this freeway runs between Chicago and New Orleans, mostly along the route of the Illinois Central Main Line, currently operated by Canadian National, and sees service from Amtrak's City of New Orleans, or at least a present-day incarnation of the Steve Goodman song about the train of the same name. Although, as you look closely at the I-55 map, you'll notice that the key word of the last sentence was mostly follows. Even though heading north, it basically parallels the Illinois Central Main Line from New Orleans to Memphis, I-55 crosses the Mississippi River and closer to the Frisco Main Line from Memphis to St. Louis, which currently sees freight service from BNSF. You can also argue that I-55 is closer to the Cape Girardeau Northern in some regions, but it's too small of a road to look into. From St. Louis, the freeway follows the Wabash, now Norfolk Southern Main Line to Litchfield, Illinois, then another Illinois Central, now Canadian National branch to Springfield, and then surprisingly a Gulf Mobile and Ohio, now Union Pacific Main Line from Springfield to Chicago, along Amtrak's present-day Lincoln service, which is the Midwest's most frequent service at 4 trains a day between Chicago and St. Louis, with various signaling and track speeds being upgraded in recent years. Next, we have another interstate that starts in Chicago, as I-57 runs from the Windy City to just past the state border in Minor, Missouri, but all its rail origins are at least a bit more stable. Starting off at Lilydale, it splits from I-94 and follows the Rock Island Main Line to Oak Forest, currently served by Metro's Rock Island District, before hopping over to the ex-Illinois Central present-day Canadian National Main Line all the way to Centralia. Well, at least just before the town before, switching to the ex-Chicago and Eastern Illinois present-day Union Pacific Main Line to Marion, and then goes back to the Illinois Central Main to Cairo. And although not connected by rail, I-57 crosses the Mississippi River and follows the now-abandoned Missouri Pacific branch to Minor, where it merges with I-55. Cairo, Illinois used to have an Amtrak stop, but this was discontinued in 1987. Although service between Carbondale and Chicago via Centralia is also served by Amtrak's Ilney and Saluki, in addition to the city of New Orleans. From the terminus city of the latter two of aforementioned trains is our next interstate, as I-59 runs from New Orleans to Chattanooga via Birmingham along a single railroad main line. Finally! Technically, this interstate splits off from I-10 at Slidell, Louisiana, and joins with I-24 at the Alabama-Tennessee border, as I-59 essentially parallels the Southern Railway main line between the two cities, with service between Birmingham and New Orleans currently being served by Amtrak's Crescent, and with freight being offered by Norfolk Southern. The reason as to why Amtrak doesn't run from Chattanooga to Birmingham is because that route was part of a longer Southern Railway line that bypassed Charlotte and Atlanta in favor of Knoxville and Asheville, and the Crescent service that Amtrak eventually took over followed the more direct route through Atlanta. After another large numbering gap that skips I-60, our next interstate is I-64, which runs from Norfolk, Virginia to St. Louis, and immediately crushes any hopes I have for simpler mapping after reviewing the last interstate. Thankfully, it's not as complicated as it looks, as I-64 only follows a few railroad main lines, starting with an engineering innovation of a bridge leading into a tunnel in the middle of a river, since bridges can only span so far. then pops up at Newport News where it follows the Chesapeake and Ohio main line to Richmond, currently operated by CSX. Then it runs between the two C&O main lines before gravitating towards the northern route owned by the Buckingham Branch short line to Clifton Forge, then follows CSX-owned C&O main line to Ashland, then following the abandoned Ashland Coal and Iron Industrial Railroad, and then an abandoned C&O branch line to Lexington, Kentucky, before transferring to a Southern Railway branch from Lexington to St. Louis, where it passes by the city's former 32-track Union Station, before running past a few more suburbs to Wentzville, somewhat close to the Wabash branch line from St. Louis to Kansas City. Even though the Southern and Wabash lines only see freight service from Norfolk Southern, Amtrak service is available between Newport News and Richmond with their successful Northeast Regional, as well as Charlottesville, Virginia to Ashland, Kentucky on the Cardinal, the other Amtrak route that only runs 3 times a week. Our next route divisible by 5 is I-65, which runs from Chicago to Mobile, Alabama, along the route of an overlooked corridor, as Mobile often isn't considered a terminus city from northern cities like Chicago. Anyways, I-65 starts by diverging by I-90 in Gary, Indiana, and passes about 10 different rail lines existing and abandoned alike, since it's so close to Chicago, but the closest line that I-65 follows is the Monon main line, currently owned by CSX, to Lafayette, Indiana, then follows an abandoned New York Central branch to Indianapolis, and then a Pennsylvania Railroad branch to Louisville, along the present-day Louisville and Indiana. It's all smooth sailing from here, as I-65 then transfers onto the Louisville-Nashville main line, owned by CSX, all the way to its terminus in Mobile. What makes the region served by this interstate interesting in particular is that they all used to see Amtrak service at one point, but has since become freight only, as the branch between Indianapolis and Louisville was formerly operated by the short-lived Kentucky Cardinal, which ran mail cars to passenger cars until 2004, as the last Amtrak service that Louisville saw, and the entire L&N corridor from Chicago to Montgomery was part of a vast network of Chicago to Florida long-distance trains, where before Amtrak, these trains would transfer operators at various southern cities, and last ran under Amtrak as the Floridian in 1979, with direct Chicago to Florida service always being avoided or neglected in various passenger rail proposals, including the 2 most recent Amtrak Connects Us map. Not exactly Route 66, but I-66 is next on the list, as this interstate is much shorter than its highway counterpart, as it only runs between Washington, D.C. and Middletown, Virginia. Judging on the short length of the interstate, I assume that I-66 would parallel the abandoned Washington and Old Dominion Railroad, but it later gravitates towards the Southern Railway's Harrisonburg branch, currently operated by Norfolk Southern, with Amtrak and Virginia Railway Express service only covering the segment between D.C. and Manassas, Virginia. Although, for a branch line in Virginia, this branch does have a bit of Pennsylvania Railroad basis, in which the branch line's terminus is in Harrisonburg instead of Harrisburg, and that I-66 ends close enough to Strasburg. Next we have another particular freeway, I-68. This interstate runs between Hancock, Maryland and Morgantown, West Virginia, and it runs directly between the Baltimore and Ohio Chicago main line and St. Louis main line, both of which are currently owned by CSX, and then ends on the Norfolk and Western present-day NS branch in Morgantown. But since this interstate runs right in between the 2 main lines, I have to say it's too close to call an official rail line or corridor that I-68 covers. Not even any interurban or streetcar lines. I'm really at a loss for words, but I guess this is a rare example of an interstate that doesn't follow an exact railroad mainline. Anyways, up next we have I-69, and oh my gosh, that is a complicated map. Many parts of this interstate are still under construction and it goes through a bunch of branch lines. Should I cover it? I don't see why not. The first segment starts off from the Grand Trunk Western Main Line, now owned by Canadian National, from Port Huron to Battle Creek, Michigan. Then it heads south close to various half-abandoned New York Central branch lines to Fort Wayne, Indiana, and then it runs in between a bunch of Midwestern branch lines, but for convenience sake, I'll declare that the most direct rail lines that parallel I-69 is the Nickel Plate Road present-day NS branch to Muncie, and the New York Central, now present-day CSX branch to Indianapolis. Afterward, it very loosely follows the Illinois Central branch line to Bloomfield, currently operated by the Indiana Railroad, then the Chicago and Eastern Illinois branch owned by the Indiana Southern Railroad to Evansville. Then it follows the CSX-owned Louisville and Nashville main line to Nortonville, and then a series of Illinois Central branch lines to Paducah and Fulton, Kentucky, currently owned by the Paducah and Louisville, and then I-69 ceases to exist once it crosses the Kentucky border. Even though I-69 doesn't show up on Railguide, its proposed map to Houston and Brownsville still shows up on Wikipedia, as it continues to follow the Illinois Central main line to Memphis, then a series of abandoned IC branch lines before crossing the Mississippi and onto a Mopac branch line to Warren, then a Rock Island line near El Dorado before jumping over to the Kansas City Southern at Shreveport, where it then follows the Southern Pacific, now Union Pacific line to Houston, then follows its respective XSP, now UP branches to Brownsville and Loretto. Despite being a long one, it still shows that even interstates that are currently under construction have at least some basis in major railroad corridors. Right after a long interstate that isn't divisible by 5 comes another long interstate that is divisible by 5, as I-70 spans from Baltimore to Cove Fort, Utah, where it meets up with I-15. I figure I might as well start on the easier side of America, and map this where there aren't too many sporadic branch lines. Starting in the small town of Cove Fort, I-70 splits off from I-15 and very loosely parallels the Rio Grande Main Line, now operated by Union Pacific between Salt Lake City and Denver, which also sees Amtrak service with the California Zephyr, as well as Rocky Mountaineer luxury service between Denver and Moab, Utah. Once at Denver, I-70 continues to follow the original Union Pacific Main Line to Kansas City, meaning its current and present-day owners are Union Pacific, albeit with no passenger service, with the exception of the Rock Island Main Line between Lyman, Colorado and Colby, Nebraska, now owned by the Kyle Railroad. After Kansas City, the freeway runs in between the Missouri Pacific Main Line and currently operated by Union Pacific and Amtrak's Missouri River Runner, and the KCS-owned Gulf Mobile and Ohio Kansas City branch from Springfield, Illinois, and the Ennis-owned Wabash branch to St. Louis. From here, I-70 loosely follows the Pennsylvania Railroad St. Louis Main Line through track ownership by CSX, Norfolk Southern, and Nunn, as well as a few abandoned Baltimore and Ohio lines near Pittsburgh, and then finally jumps down to the CSX-owned Baltimore and Ohio Main Line from Hancock, Maryland to Baltimore, which also sees service by Amtrak's Capital Limited. Not counting the nearby I-68, I would have to say that I-70 diverged the most from various railroad main lines, in which half of the time it perfectly parallels them, while the other half it's nowhere near any specific railroad main line. Meanwhile, I-71 follows a bit of a more well-known rail corridor, as it not only follows the popular 3C corridor between Cleveland, Columbus, and Cincinnati, but it also runs past this and onto Louisville. Starting from the odd city out of the corridor, I-71 follows the CSX-owned Louisville National branch of Cincinnati, and then follows the Baltimore and Ohio branch of Columbus, currently owned by the Indiana and Ohio, and then, just like the last interstate, it loosely follows the CSX-owned New York Central Secondary to Cleveland. Despite being popular for passenger runs back in the 50s, the 3C corridor has never seen any passenger service since the formation of Amtrak in 1971. Amtrak is looking to change this by not only introducing 3C service between Cleveland and Cincinnati, but also to make Columbus a hub for various other intercity passenger rail routes with questionable historic routings and termini. Speaking of questionable routings, I feel like something's up with the terminus city of our next interstate, I-72, since it barely crosses into the Missouri border at Hannibal and only runs through the state for 1.5 miles after starting in Champaign, Illinois. Despite its mid-state routing, it follows a relatively stable railroad mapping as it follows the Ennis-owned Wabash Main Line from just under Quincy to Decatur, before following a half-abandoned Illinois Central branch line to Champaign, owned by the Decatur Junction Railroad. I can't really say that Quincy to Champaign is a popular corridor in particular, but at least there is some freight service along the corridor today, and it was in the middle of the main lines for one of the most famous Class 1s, whose cannonball service from St. Louis to Detroit wasn't too far away from this interstate. Oh boy, another example where a good part of the interstate is proposed, and I might as well cover anyway. I-73 currently runs between Ellerbay and Greensboro, North Carolina, but is proposed to span from Mackinac City, Michigan, all the way to Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. You know it's big when Wikipedia doesn't even have the option to zoom in on a custom map. For the section of I-73 that actually exists as of when this video was made, it follows the Southern Railway branch line from Greensboro to Asheboro, where it then transfers onto a mostly abandoned original Norfolk Southern branch line to its terminus in Ellerbay. An odd feature about this interstate is that the southern trackage is owned by today's Norfolk Southern, but the original Norfolk Southern branch lines in red were technically owned by another, smaller Norfolk Southern that was acquired by the Southern before becoming Norfolk Southern by merging with the Norfolk and Western. As for the proposed or currently under construction sections of this interstate, since there's only a photo and no interactive map of I-73, I'm just going to make my best guess for this interstate. From Ellerbay, I-73 will head down to Hamlet, where it will follow a CSX-owned Seaboard Airline branch line to Mullen, South Carolina, and then hop onto an R.J. Corman-owned Atlantic Coastline branch to Myrtle Beach. While heading north, I-73 will roughly follow the Norfolk and Western, now Norfolk Southern trackage from Winston-Salem to Roanoke, where it will then join the N&W main line to Columbus, and then follow a series of New York Central branches all the way to Mackinac City, Michigan. For any highways that are currently under construction, please add a railway median so that we can get rail service back in these regions. Now, as I was mapping the last two interstates, I noticed the appearance of the same freeway, I-74. That's because it's split up into two separate freeways, as the US DOT isn't even planning on connecting them, so I might as well cover both. The western I-74 is the longer of the two as it runs between Davenport, Iowa and Cincinnati, as it starts by following a BNSF-owned Burlington route branch from Davenport to Peoria, Illinois. Then it briefly follows the NS-owned Nickel Plate Road branch to Bloomington, and then it parallels various New York Central branch lines all the way to Cincinnati that are either abandoned, owned by CSX, or owned by the Central of Indiana Railroad. The eastern I-74, on the other hand, runs between a bunch of towns in North Carolina, thanks to being downgraded to a U.S. highway in some sections, with one small segment only running from Mount Airy, and another segment that starts at a town literally named Four Seasons, just like the hotel, then follows the exact same route as I-73, and then parallels the CSX-owned Seaboard Airlines Straightway from Rockingham to Wilmington. As weird as the routing for some of these interstates are, at least they're not too hard to find the route origins for. Up next we have another long one as I-75 runs between Miami and Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan. Starting off from the south, I-75 makes a sharp left turn out of Miami through Everglades National Park and towards Naples, a perfect straightaway that's been studied for so many passenger rail studies due to the freeway's median. Then I-75 goes back and forth between Seaboard Airline and Atlantic Coastline trackage all the way to Lake City before following the NS-owned Southern Railway to Atlanta. Then it parallels CSX-owned Nashville, Chattanooga, and St. Louis trackage to Chattanooga before going back and forth between NS-owned Southern and CSX-owned Louisville, Nashville trackage up to Cincinnati through long segments. Afterwards, I-75 follows CSX-owned Baltimore and Ohio trackage to Lima, Ohio, the same town as the famous locomotive building company, then an NS-owned Nickel Plate Road line to Findlay, and then a series of New York Central branches from Toledo to Detroit and up to Mackinac City, where it finally travels near Canadian National-owned Sioux Line trackage to the Michigan border at Sault Ste. Marie. Man, this interstate is a huge game of hot potato from railroad to railroad, and primarily between the same two Class 1s of the East. Next we have another double whammy, this one being particularly odd as it has two separate Wikipedia pages. The first I-76 runs between Denver and Big Springs, Nebraska, where it essentially parallels the Union Pacific Denver branch where it splits off from their Omaha to Salt Lake City main line, while also being close to the BNSF-owned Burlington route main line to Denver, while the other I-76 is the longer of the two, running between almost Akron, Ohio and Philadelphia, by very loosely following the NS-owned Pennsylvania Railroad main line until Harrisburg, where it also loosely follows the NS-owned Reading Railroad main line to Philly. I'm really not sure why the US DOT didn't rename one of these two interstates, especially considering that there are large numbering gaps earlier in the system, but maybe it's just to make this task of mapping every interstate harder for me. Next we have another example of an interstate that likes to jump from one main line to another, as I-77 runs from Cleveland to Columbia, South Carolina, a straight line but not too popular of a travel corridor. Starting off, I-77 follows a Baltimore and Ohio branch to Akron and New Philadelphia, which is currently operated by the Cuyahoga Scenic Valley Tourist Road and the Wheeling and Lake Erie. Afterwards, it follows an abandoned Pennsylvania branch to Marietta, then jumps in between a whole lot of coal line branch lines once owned by the Big Three West Virginia coal haulers, that being Chesapeake and Ohio, Norfolk and Western, and Virginian, then cuts across the NS-owned N&W Bristol Secondary, a Southern Railway Wilkesboro branch owned by the Yadkin Valley Railroad, and then the NS-owned Southern trackage from Statesville, North Carolina to Columbia. Yet another example of a freeway cutting across railroad mainlines and secondaries, albeit through already remote areas, but it would still help for these less popular traffic corridors to see some rail service, again, possibly through placed railways and highway medians. For an interstate that technically starts in the largest and most populous city in the US, it sure has the weirdest terminus. I-78 is our next interstate on the list, as it runs from the center of Manhattan in Canal Street and ends in Jonestown, Pennsylvania, where it merges with I-81. I feel that Jonestown in particular is a very odd place to end in, since it stops right in between Reading and Harrisburg, two major towns along the Reading Main Line. Anyways, from here it follows the NS-owned Reading Main Line to Allentown, albeit arguably closer to an abandoned Reading branch to Hamburg, and then follows the Central Road New Jersey Main Line to Jersey City before going into the Holland Tunnel and into NYC. This particular corridor, or at least up to Allentown, has been studied for decades for passenger service restoration by Amtrak, since NJT only runs service up to High Bridge, New Jersey, as this corridor was even included in the recent Connexus map, but doesn't go further to Reading or Harrisburg, which is the corridor which also desperately needs passenger service. Now, I feel anything at less than 120 miles, such as New York to Allentown service, should be operated by commuter railroads like NJT instead of Amtrak, but that's a topic all on its own. Like many interstates in this list, I-79's road origins start out straightforward, but then get messier as it moves south, as this freeway runs between Erie, Pennsylvania and Charleston, West Virginia. Even though it runs closer to various Erie and Pennsylvania railroad branches, I-79 follows the same corridor as the Bessemer and Lake Erie Railroad, a huge factor in moving steel for Andrew Carnegie, currently owned by Canadian National. And then it follows a semi-abandoned PRR branch to Waynesburg, then a NS-owned N&W branch to Fairmont, West Virginia, and then various abandoned B&O branches all the way to Charleston. I must admit, I do find it interesting that some of these interstates not only parallel certain railroad main lines, but it also connects a bunch of random or lesser known branch lines from otherwise remote parts of the country, likely to gain more traffic. Up next we have a true coast-to-coast interstate as I-80 spans from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific, the ideal New York to California corridor. In true coast-to-coast fashion, we'll be starting on the East Coast in New Jersey and head our way west, as I-80 starts off by diverging from another famous coast-to-coast corridor, I-95. This interstate starts out by following a little bit of the New York Susquehanna Western Main Line from Hackensack to Paterson before transferring to the New Jersey Transit-owned Lackawanna Railroad Main Line to Mount Pocono, Pennsylvania. Then it cuts through even more coal mine branch lines owned by the anthracite coal roads, such as the Pennsylvania, Reading, and Lehigh Valley, then runs through a bunch of existing and abandoned branch lines to Cleveland due to its access to Lake Erie, before eventually starting to gravitate towards the NSO New York Central Main Line just before Chicago, with passenger service currently being offered by Amtrak's Lakeshore Limited. Once in the Chicago region, it follows the former Rock Island Main Line to Omaha, currently operated by the Iowa Interstate Railroad. Yes, that's a railroad and not another interstate. Then it follows the BNSF-owned Burlington Main Line a bit to Grand Island, Nebraska, before following the Union Pacific Main Line to Salt Lake City, then a little bit of the West Pacific Main Line to Wells, Nevada, before finally following the UP-owned Southern Pacific Main Line to San Francisco, with the last two sections currently seeing passenger service from Amtrak's California Zephyr. This freeway does a great job of covering all the primary main lines of most of America's most famous railroads, as longer interstates truly emphasize how large railroads made these cities and corridors that the interstates followed decades after the railroads were built. Despite its somewhat long length, I-81 is another example of having weird termini, namely Danbridge, Tennessee, and the Canadian border at Wellesley Island, New York, and for following no one specific travel corridor, other than running close to the Allegheny Mountains. From south to north, I-81 starts by following a NS-owned southern line to Bristol, Tennessee, before transferring the former N&W trackage to Waynesboro, Virginia. Then it follows former B&O Southern and Pennsy trackage to Hagerstown, Maryland, and then another Pennsy branch to Harrisburg. Then it runs through various abandoned coal mine branches of the Reading and Pennsy, then Lackawanna Railroad trackage from Wilkes-Barre to Syracuse, New York, before finally following various New York Central branches to Wellesley Island. Although this isn't a popular corridor in its entirety, I would like to state that Scranton to Syracuse and Hagerstown to Roanoke are pretty underrated corridors since they only saw local or mixed train service back in the day, and would benefit a lot of local towns between them if service were to be restored. Oh look, another short interstate that tags an adjacent state because reasons. I-82 follows a segment of a much larger main line for the Northern Pacific, currently operated by BNSF, as it starts out in Hermiston, Oregon near UP trackage, as it splits from I-84, then crosses the Columbia River and past some Spokane, Portland, and Seattle trackage to Kennewick, Washington, and then I-82 follows the Northern Pacific main line to Ellensburg, where it merges with I-90. Nothing too much to say about this interstate, other than it's another somewhat short connector that just so happened to parallel a railroad. Speaking of easy-to-follow interstates that parallel less than two rail lines, I-83 essentially parallels the Pennsylvania Railroad's York branch, originally the Northern Central Railroad, from Baltimore to Harrisburg, which is currently rail-trailed up to New Freedom, Pennsylvania, and then operated by the Steam into History Heritage Railroad, which rosters classic American 440s, and then follows NS-owned trackage into Harrisburg. Even though this line sees nowhere near as much use today as it did decades ago, this little branch was once home to various namesake passenger trains of the Pennsy, specifically for their Washington, D.C. service, as segments of their trains would be split up and travel down this branch to D.C., while the rest of the train continued to New York City. Up next we have another double whammy as we have two unconnected I-84s, with the first one ranging from Salt Lake City to Portland, Oregon, and the second one running between the less popular Scranton and Southbridge, Massachusetts. The first and longer of the I-84s thankfully is easier to follow, as it essentially parallels the Union Pacific's Portland main line, while the I-84 of the East Coast follows the abandoned Scranton branch of the Erie Railroad that meets up with the Erie's main line to Maybrook, currently owned by Metro-North, and then follows the abandoned New Haven-Maybrook freight main line to Danbury, Connecticut, before following a series of mostly abandoned New Haven branch lines to Waterbury, Hartford, and Southbridge, where its interstate converges with I-90, which is just outside of Worcester. Despite being once a popular travel corridor as UP essentially provided the only direct service between Salt Lake and Portland, the first I-84 last saw passenger service with Amtrak's Pioneer in 1995, which was discontinued due to a series of long-distance service cuts, although there have been various proposals to restore service from Portland to Boise, Idaho, as well as Salt Lake City. Although there aren't any direct plans to restore passenger service on any of the abandoned New Haven rail branches in Connecticut, a bunch of proposed high-speed rail maps have highlighted Hartford to Worcester or Boston service as a faster alternative to the existing Northeast Corridor, which would have to follow at least one of these abandoned branch lines. The only problem now is figuring out where exactly to build a new right-of-way. After all that, our next interstate divisible by 5 is thankfully a rather short and simple one to map, as I-85 connects Montgomery and Richmond, two of the most significant cities of the South at one point. From south to north, I-85 follows the CSX-owned Atlanta and West Point main line from Montgomery to Atlanta, then the NS-owned Southern main line from Atlanta to Durham, North Carolina, and then follows the currently under restoration S-line of the Seaboard Airlines to Petersburg, Virginia, which is just outside of Richmond. Luckily, all of these corridors are being studied for passenger service, as Atlanta to Montgomery service was listed in Amtrak's Connexus map, and Atlanta to Durham is currently served by Amtrak's Crescent, with a current passenger rail proposal to upgrade the existing alignment between Charlotte and Atlanta for high-frequency passenger service, possibly to be operated by Brightline. And then the S-line between Durham, Raleigh, and Richmond was recently purchased by the Virginia DOT for future dedicated passenger service, so it'll definitely be great to see what the future has in store for the various proposals along the I-85 corridor. Up next we have yet another double whammy. Wait a minute, how many more of these are there? Oh come on, really? 3 in a row? Are you deliberately trying to make my job harder? I just passed 10,000 words in the script, but, well, at least they don't look too long. But I'm still going to speed through them. Starting off with our first I-86, this interstate serves as a connector between I-84 and I-15 as it runs parallel to the Union Pacific Portland main line between Pocatello and Burley, Idaho, albeit closer to a UP branch line, but whatever, it's close enough to the main line, and it makes my job easier, so we'll count it as just the main line for now. The second I-86 starts at Erie, Pennsylvania, and cuts past the Buffalo and Pittsburgh-owned Pennsylvania secondary, and then essentially parallels the former Erie Railroad main line, currently owned by the Western New York and Pennsylvania Railroad, until it reaches Waverly and makes the mistake of touching the New Jersey border and gets banished to the Shadow Realm. It just so happens that this corridor was also included in the more recent Connexus map by Amtrak, but for some reason it supposedly starts in Erie and runs to Birmingham, despite there being no switches that allow such a direct route at the moment, so this is definitely one of the more unusual passenger rail proposals in the area. Moving on, the first I-87 just so happens to be the shortest interstate in the entire system at a total of just 13 miles long, running between Raleigh and Wendell, North Carolina, as this recently upgraded highway parallels the original Norfolk Southern main line, which is currently owned by the Carolina Coastal Short Line. However, this interstate is currently being expanded, or upgraded, all the way to Norfolk, which unsurprisingly follows the rest of the Norfolk Southern right-of-way. Meanwhile, the much longer and older I-87 runs from New York City to the New York-Canada border by starting in the Bronx, and follows the abandoned New York Central Putnam branch, then crosses the Hudson River and along a few Erie Railroad branch lines and a main line owned by Metro North. Then it loosely follows the busy CSX-owned New York Central River line to Albany, and then loosely follows the Canadian Pacific-owned Delaware and Hudson main line from Albany to the border near Rouse's Point. Amtrak service is mostly provided by the Adirondack that runs from New York City to Montreal, while passenger service was proposed on the Tappan Zee Bridge where I-87 crosses the Hudson River, but sadly these plans never went through. Lastly, our final double whammy is I-88, whose west coast route runs from almost Chicago to almost Davenport by jumping back and forth between the BNSF-owned Burlington route main line and the UP-owned CNW main line, and then a Burlington branch to East Moline, Illinois. And the east coast route follows the much simpler Delaware and Hudson, now Canadian Pacific Binghamton branch between Binghamton and Albany. Again, I really don't see why you have to give two different interstates the same number, especially when there are large numbering gaps earlier on. Maybe there's a regional rule that I'm not reading into, but I'm just here to state railroad main lines that are mostly parallel to these oddly numbered interstates. Now that all the double whammies are out of the way, we're finally entering the home stretch as I-89 follows a part of a once key corridor between Concord, New Hampshire and Burlington, Vermont. Back in the day, the Boston and Maine would take many passenger trains running from Boston to Montreal to White River Junction, where they would be transferred to the Central Vermont Railway to Burlington and St. Albans, where Canadian National will finish the trip to Montreal. Although the B&M segment has since been abandoned, the Central Vermont section is still used by the New England Central and sees service from Amtrak's Vermonter between Washington, D.C. and St. Albans, Vermont. This particular corridor could see a revitalization if direct Boston to Montreal passenger service were to be restored, as many proposed high-speed maps include this corridor. Up next we have I-90, the longest interstate in the entire system, at 3,020 miles long, spanning from Boston to Seattle. Starting this massive journey practically right outside of Boston South Station, I-90 follows the CSX-owned Boston and Albany main line between its two namesake cities, with some segments of the B&A main line near Boston being plowed just to make way for I-90. Then it practically follows the rest of the New York Central Main Line to Chicago, with Amtrak service between Boston and Chicago being offered by the Lakeshore Limited. From Chicago, I-90 follows semi-abandoned CNW branch lines to Madison, Wisconsin, while passing the Illinois Railway Museum, and then follows the Canadian Pacific-owned Milwaukee Road trackage from Madison to La Crosse, Wisconsin, then various Milwaukee Road branch lines to Rapid City, South Dakota, where it passes Mount Rushmore. Then it jumps over BNSF-owned Burlington route trackage to Billings, Montana, and then it jumps back and forth between BNSF-owned trackage between the Milwaukee Road and Northern Pacific main lines all the way to Seattle. Overall, a great representation of some of America's most important cross-country main lines, along with some surprises of combining some lesser-known branch lines in the Midwest. Not as long as I-90, I-91 runs along a considerable distance between New Haven and the Vermont-Canada border at Newport. The interstate starts by following the New Haven-Springfield line, currently owned by Amtrak, and then Boston and Maine trackage all the way to Newport, where the line used to continue to Sherbrooke, where it interchanged with Canadian Pacific. Despite being a straight line north, the New Haven and Newport service isn't as popular as a Vermonter that split from B&M trackage at White River Junction, which is also where track ownership switches from New England Central to the Vermont Railway. Other than the Vermonter, frequent passenger service between New Haven and Greenfield, Massachusetts is offered by Amtrak's recently inaugurated Valley Flyer, as well as ConnDOT's Hartford line between New Haven and Springfield. Not too far away is I-93, which also runs along a main line in Vermont, this time being another Boston and Maine route from Boston to St. Johnsbury, Vermont. Even though I-93 loosely follows this main line, it runs through a section of two branch lines that, for some reason, don't connect past Franconia and Notch State Park, with the southernmost of the two branches currently being operated by the Hoboken Railroad Tourist Line, while the rest of the route is owned by the New England Southern, CSX, and MBTA. Much longer and further away than last interstate is I-94, which spans from Port Huron, Michigan to Lockwood, Montana. Since the last cross-country interstate was covered from east to west, might as well start in the opposite direction from west to east, as I-94 splits from I-90 and follows the BNSF-owned Northern Pacific main line to Fargo, North Dakota, then follows an abandoned Great Northern secondary to St. Paul instead of its main line, then the UP-owned CNW main line to Chicago while being somewhat close to the Milwaukee Road main line, then it follows the CSX-owned Pierre Marquette main to Hartford, Michigan, before jumping to the Amtrak-owned Michigan Central main line to Detroit, and then a Canadian National-owned Grand Trunk Western branch line to Port Huron. The former Northern Pacific main line is currently hoping to see passenger service restored, with the Amtrak North Coast Hiawatha proposed to return between Chicago and Seattle via Billings, Montana, and a private company is planning on operating a Brightline-like model between St. Paul and Eau Claire, Wisconsin on the ex-CNW main line. And Amtrak currently runs between Chicago and Detroit on the MC Main with their Tri-Staley Blue Water. Finally, the famous I-95 running from Maine to Miami, and one of the most famous north-to-south interstates of them all. Starting at the US-Canadian border in Houlton, it follows the Bangor and Aroostook main line currently operated by the Maine Northern, then it follows the CSX-owned Maine Central main line from Bangor to Portland, and then the Boston and Maine Eastern line to Boston, which was recently featured in Fixing Your Branch Line. Then it follows the New Haven main line to New York City by paralleling the popular Northeast Corridor operated by Amtrak Northeast Regional and Nacella, and other than a few abandoned Penn State branches in New Jersey, it mostly follows the Pennsylvania Road section of the Northeast Corridor to DC, and the CSX-owned Baltimore and Ohio main line to DC. I-95 then parallels the CSX-owned Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac main line to Richmond, before following the Atlantic Coast Line's A line to Jacksonville, Florida, along with weaving in between a few ACL branch lines, and then it parallels the Florida East Coast main line all the way to Miami. The closest service that Amtrak has to offer for this entire route is the Silver Star from New York to Miami, even though it doesn't use the Florida East Coast main line. And the fastest service in the same region is Amtrak's Auto Train, from almost DC to almost Orlando, where passengers can drive their car on the auto carriers and enjoy non-stop express service from Lorton, Virginia to Sanford, Florida. Much lesser known is I-96, that runs from Motown to Grand Rapids by paralleling the CSX-owned Pierre Marquette main line, and then goes to Lake Michigan by running to Muskegon, along an abandoned Grand Trunk Western branch, where freight cars would be ferried over to various towns in Wisconsin. Although this isn't the closest branch to I-96, the interstate is close enough to the home branch of a very famous railcar in this channel, that being Pennsylvania Road number 4663, the streamlined Doodlebug. Meanwhile, passenger service between Detroit and Grand Rapids is a hit or miss for passenger rail proposals, as some maps include it while others don't, but no passenger service is too small to be restored and should still be studied for future use. The existence of I-97 is rather sad for railroading history, as it parallels an interurban rail from Baltimore to Annapolis, Maryland, specifically to Baltimore and Annapolis. Now, an interurban railway is an early predecessor to light rail, in which electric-powered railcars serve a bunch of rural towns between two hubs, but these are much lesser known and operate with much less when compared to a regular railroad. So to see an entire interstate dedicated to replacing a small interurban seems like a bit much. I can see a local highway or popular street rivaling this little interurban, but come on now, is a full-on freeway really necessary to rival this poor little line? Last but not least, in the middle of Pennsylvania, we end with I-99, which is also currently under construction between two of its sections, likely as one last trick question for this video's task. Starting from Bedford, I-99 follows a bunch of Pennsy branch lines, starting from an abandoned section to Sproul, then Everett Railroad ownership to Hollidaysburg, Norfolk Southern trackage to Tyrone, and then Nittany and Bald Eagle trackage to Bellefonte, where the interstate merges with I-80. On the New York side, I-99 runs between Lindsay and Corning by paralleling a New York Central branch line owned by the Wellsboro and Corning, so this interstate is expected to follow the abandoned New York Central branch line to Bellefonte, where it will reconnect with its Pennsylvania counterpart. Although there isn't too much passenger history in this specific region, it's still one of many branch lines in this part of the state that transported loads of anthracite coal to destinations all across America. And with that, we have finally covered the various road origins of all 70 freeways of the Interstate Highway System. We've covered a bunch of diverse interstates that widely vary in terms of length, travel corridors, and road origins, but at the end of the day, this task goes to show that there was at least some form of railroad that wasn't too far away from the interstate, whether they be bustling main lines carrying premier passenger trains, or simple branch lines that connected smaller towns with larger routes. Before you ask, I'm not going to cover auxiliary highways, or the interstate's answer to branch lines, just there are too many of them to fit into one video, even though they also have their own rail-based origins. Huge thanks to the Rail Guide app for providing the location of these interstates with respect to the past and present railroad right-of-ways, as this video couldn't have been made without it. Thank you again for watching, and if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like and subscribe for more. Have a good day.